Well,
cue the theme music.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 40 of the iPhreaks Show. This week on our panel we have Pete Hodgson.
Good morning from the Baghdad of the West.
Where's that?
San Francisco. I looked it up after the last episode when everyone had a nickname, and I didn't. I looked it up on Wikipedia. I've got a list now that I can go off of for quite a few weeks.
Got it. Andrew Madsen.
Hello from Salt Lake City. I really think we don't have a nickname for our city.
James Zuber.
Hello from South Canada.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv. And this week we have a special guest, Saul Mora.
Hello from Denver, home of the Denver Broncos, your next Super Bowl champions.
I honestly think that's most likely the case. So, you haven't been on the show for a while. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Do I need an introduction? Really?
Wow.
He's that guy from that show.
I'm just messing with you guys, man. I've got a common attitude now, I guess. So yeah, I'm Saul. I write code. I work for my little company called Magical Panda Software. I do another podcast called NS Brief. I wrote Magical Record. I do lots of different things here and there. I'm a busy guy, I guess, so I forget everything that I do.
Okay.
I think with everyone from all the different podcasts on everyone else's podcast, it's like the 80s when every show had someone from Facts of Life.
On this very special episode of iPhreaks Show.
It's kind of like that.
Are we going to get the Fonz on in a sec?
Oh, man.
That would be great. I wonder if he knows anything about iOS development.
Probably not.
Probably if he has any bugs, he just kind of like does that thing where he whacks the side of the iPhone just right and it fixes itself.
Oh, really?
I mean, that's how I fix my iPhone.
Crickets. Oh,
That's how I void my warranty. All right, well, we did the episode on MVC, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago-ish? And I think it was more than that when we recorded it because we recorded extra episodes to get through Christmas. Anyway, we talked about the Responder Chain, or we mentioned the Responder Chain. We also, we got an email from Saul, and he was being very nice about stuff that we may not have mentioned that we should have. So, I'm kind of curious as to, what your take on that is, and then we'll just kind of move through the topics from there.
Well, and I think a lot of what I had to say also revolves around a lot of the Twitter conversations that have been going around lately. I know Ash Furrow recently posted a blog post on model view model patterns, and even before that, there's the Reactive Cocoa guys talking about stateless designs, and all these extra ways to kind of design your iOS applications that are different from MVC. And I think covering MVC, it's a hard thing to do because it feels like such a classical pattern, and it feels like, oh, we're in this modern world where things don't apply. The rules are different for us. And we come up with all these different names for things when it's really it's kind of the same deal, but different different subtle takes and subtle approaches to things. When in reality is what it seems to me is that if you really just kind of dig down into the core design principles of things, how to design applications properly so that you don't have, a lot of redundancy and craziness and so that you can kind of keep track of where everything and things like that, it kind of doesn't matter what the name of the pattern is. It just matters that you design an application that you can actually fix when things go wrong.
So you're saying we don't have to obsess with whether we're MVVM or MVP or MVC or MV star or MVBBQ or...
Right. I guess it's trying to reach a higher level of nirvana, right? It's
transcending the patterns.
And that's the thing is I've learned, I used to be a huge student of patterns, and I still am. But I think, it's like any piece of advice or knowledge or wisdom, you got to take it with a grain of salt and, apply what's right. You get down to the core fundamental principles of things, and they don't always nicely fit into a pattern or a template or some kind of, pre-designed architecture. And that's not to say there aren't like valid architectures and patterns that you can start off with. It's just you have to also realize that you have to know the rules before you can break the rules, right? So it's kind of that way, and that's kind of how I was kind of I was listening to your episode, I was thinking about that. I was like, well, it's great for beginners, but I think it's good to still explain that there are exceptions to the rules, and they're valid exceptions, and there are other ways to do things, and you can still use MVC and use it pretty well these days, and still kind of have have a different way to kind of organize your app, and still use MVC. So
I guess that's the challenge with all of these pattern-y things, is they're kind of like, when you're kind of early on in your learning, in your kind of like journey down the road of architectural enlightenment or whatever, you need something pretty prescriptive, right? So I don't know, I'm a big fan of the Dreyfus model, which is this like model for how we learn. And that talks about like when you're a beginner at something, you just need like loads of prescriptive advice. So if you're like a beginner chef, you just want like very, very step-by-step rote instructions on how to cook, whatever you're cooking. Then as you kind of like gain levels of enlightenment on like the deep profunditudes of food, then you can start kind of deviating from the path, right? And like if the recipe calls for garlic and onions, you might kind of decide that in your context you want to cook with shallots instead, or use red onions rather than white onions or whatever. I kind of feel like the challenge is to know where you are on that scale, and kind of once you've spent a little bit of time just following the recipe exactly, you need to start understanding the principles behind the practices, right? Like, but why is MVC good or bad? And like, so that you can start deviating. That's my take on what you're saying, Saul.
Right. And I'm also trying to kind of, I guess, address some of the haters out there on the Twitterverse, just because, I have a lot of respect for the GitHub guys that are, that have the time and the ability to do something like Reactive Cocoa. But, Reactive Cocoa isn't the end all solution to everything either. It's really using, again, putting another tool in your toolbox, having that available for when it's the right time to use it. And that doesn't mean that you have to throw away all the other things that you've learned. And that's, this is kind of coming at the, after a long career of writing applications and things and doing a lot of studying over the years. So it's like you said, just kind of, knowing where you are on that scale, knowing if you're a beginner or intermediate or advanced guy. I think it also comes down to just kind of the, that whole 10,000 hours of experience. Was it that Malcolm Gladwell book?
Yeah.
Was it Blink or something? Or
no, it's Outliers. But
Outliers, right?
The 10,000 hours is to get to be like the top of the top, the best of the best. The people that are playing, professional sports kind of level. So you don't even need 10,000 hours to be proficient.
Right. And I think for developers, it may be even be more. It might be more. I mean, and so here's the other thing is like I mentioned jokingly, it's about achieving nirvana in your design and your application skills. And I think there's another level beyond the 10,000 hours where you kind of become more than proficient, more than, I guess, competent in your field. You kind of achieve, like I said, this Zen state of like where you kind of see things, you start to see things differently and put things together in a different way so that you can really start challenging the way things work. And I think that's the level. I can't say that I'm at that level or not. I try to aspire to those kinds of levels. So,
and here's the frustrating thing about that is once you hit that kind of expert status or that Zen status, it's actually really hard for you to describe why things are good or bad to people who are like lower down on that scale, because the way that you think about problems is really different, right? So for you, Saul, in your Zen state, in your architectural Zen state that we've just decided you're in, if you like something's a good idea or a bad idea, so for a specific type of application, the reactive approach is going to work really well, or is going to work really badly, or not work well. Let's say you describing that to someone who's lower down on that Dreyfus scale is actually going to be quite hard, because the way that you think about things is going to be very abstract. Right? It's going to be very kind of bound to context, and it's really, really hard to translate that, because you have to bundle up so many concepts at the same time when you're explaining that. So you have to kind of, before you can talk about one thing, you have to kind of chunk it down into talking about the underlying things behind that and explain that principle, and then before you know it, you've been talking for an hour and you still haven't really started talking about why something's wrong for that context.
All right, so getting back to the actual conversation at hand, I guess, about, talking about MVC and all that stuff, speaking at way too high a level. I think, as a kind of an educator myself, I consider myself an educator in the iOS and and the Mac developer space, I try to explain some of these higher level concepts in simpler terms. So at least, people can kind of get an idea and do some more research themselves and do that as well. So, as far as what you were talking about in the MVC show a couple of weeks ago, the one thing that really struck me, if I recall correctly, was that you only briefly, passingly mentioned the responder chain. And the responder chain, I think, is not the end-all solution to a lot of the MVC's woes, but I think it's a good start to looking at how to use the responder chain to decouple your apps. And that's kind of a talk that I gave, and you mentioned that as well, that talk on design patterns that I gave at the MDevCon last year and all that. And really what that talk was about was using the responder chain to decouple a lot of the connections between your apps so that, when it comes time to change a hierarchy, you need to introduce a view or remove a view or a view controller or such. It doesn't really matter as long as it's within the responder chain, which on iOS kind of happens automatically. So
I'm going to play the role of someone who doesn't get all of the details of this stuff. So is this responder chain stuff an alternative to MVC, or is it a way of using MVC, or where does it fall in that?
So the responder chain is, I guess it's a chain of responsibility is, I guess, the classical gang of four design pattern. But it's funny because if you take a look at the responder chain when your app is built up, it's actually more of a tree. Basically what happens when your app is drawn on the screen for iOS, you've got all these views, buttons, tap areas, all these things that can respond to touch events, or even more than touch events, motion events, push notification events, basically outside inputs into your application. And that's what a responder is. So if you notice, if you look at the docs, you notice that UI responder is really a non-visual control. I believe UI control even subclasses from UI responder. The responder is basically something that can respond to outside input. So as far as how it fits into the MVC pattern is, I think of it as more of a communication channel of getting things from the views into the models. And I think that was the big, maybe point of contention in that last show was, well, how do you have these things observe stuff without being tightly coupled and all this stuff? And it really comes down to you have to define some kind of language. In Objective-C, we have protocols that hold that very definition. But we're not really bound to that. Objective-C is so flexible that we can just send any old message up the responder chain pipeline, and if it doesn't get handled, then nothing happens, and that can also be a problem. But you should also try to handle that as well.
So, can you go into more detail or can you give us like a concrete example of how this would work using the responder chain? So, I don't know, maybe just a trivial example of you've got like a standard, a login page, let's say, and you wanna handle all of the interactions between the view and the controller that might happen during that login.
Sure. So, take your CodeMonkey login page that manager Rob actually went and implemented, and so you've got like a login or a username, and you've got a password field, and you've got the little login button. So if you're familiar with iOS a little bit, what you'll do is when you have that username, so you want the keyboard to show up, right when that login form shows up, you'll go ahead and say keyboard, or no, it's a text field, basically a self.login field, become first responder. So that's kind of one clue as to what's going on there, is that you're telling the system that you want the first responder, or basically the control or the responder that's in the system, you want that to accept all the incoming events. And what that does is kind of tells the system, well, okay, this is a text field. Okay, you can become the first responder, and it's got some built-in stuff there to fire up the keyboard, and the keyboard then will, fire off basically key press events and fill in that text field for you. And that's just kind of the first thing. And you also notice that if you've got a UI text field or a text view delegate, you'll have a should return delegate method. I don't remember the exact signature, but it's basically said, if you hit return, should this return? And with login fields, you basically don't want any return characters, so you just say, you tell it to return no, And then what you do there is you say, well, what's my, you want to implement the next responder, which would be the password field. So you tell it, in that method, you say, well, did I just come from the text, from the login, or the username, text field? If I did, and I hit the return key, well, I want to jump to the password field and want to start entering the password in there. And it's really just, entering in that delegate method and, just basically doing that same logic. And it's usually like 3 lines of code. One of them is an if statement and the other one is a return no statement. So that's a pretty simple thing. And then from there, what you can also do is in that same delegate, you can say, well, was the delegate the password field? And I hit return. Well, what should happen next? Well, by default, it should go ahead and kick off the login mechanism. And now this is where it gets a little bit more complicated as far as the way that I see things, is that a lot of people will go ahead and put their login functionality right in that view controller that's containing all those views and those delegate callbacks and everything. And they'll fire off a network thing to go and log into your web service, and they'll fire off a bunch of spinny stuff there to make sure that it looks like something's happening. And you'll have all these blocks and all these things kind of going off right there. And the way that I would do it instead is, you use the same responder chain. So instead of just calling another method within that view controller, you basically have all of your login functionality living in a separate subsystem somewhere, basically outside of that view controller. And it could be anywhere along the responder chain. And my suggestion is to make another class that kind of sits in the application delegate. And it's not application delegate methods that you attach to it. This is another class that is a responder after the application delegate. And I'll talk about which ones are in the chain in a minute. But basically what you want to do is send a login command with that information that tells you how to log in, and send that up the chain so that this other network thing can do the login for you.
So that makes sense to me. The login view controller is responsible for kind of managing the view, controlling the view, but it's not responsible for figuring out, it's responsible for managing the login UI, but it's not responsible for the actual act of logging in, because it's a view controller, not a business logic, everything in the application lives in here controller.
Right. It's not a network controller or a controller in that kind of sense. It's not meant to control all of your business logic. I guess for the enterprisey folks, your business logic isn't live in a view controller. That's just trying to, like it says, control the view, which means displaying where the cursor goes, what becomes a responder when, how to react to a failed login maybe, basically by displaying a failed login prompt. Things like that, but the actual act of doing the login and all that stuff is somewhere else in the system. And frankly, that the best way that you could do it is to basically have the view controller not really care. And by not caring, it's basically designing it to an interface. And that's where protocols again come in. And you could do that more explicitly, or you could do it implicitly with just, a magic selector somewhere that you just happen to know, and it happens to send that up the responder chain.
So, Saul, in the system you're describing, does the view controller have any knowledge of kind of the login handler that's in the responder chain, or is it just kind of nebulously passed up?
So, as far as login handler, you're talking about the actual thing that performs the login?
Right. Talks to the service or does whatever it needs to do.
Right. And so this is kind of where I've been a little ambiguous with this protocol definition. Now, the thing is in order to use a responder chain, you need to know the selector, because the selector is the message. So basically, I guess in general terms, the responder chain is sending messages to a bunch of different handlers in the chain, and whoever wants to handle it, or basically the first one that can handle it, should handle it. And if they want to, they can pass it back up the chain and stuff. And there is no formal definition of what selector you can pass up the chain. It's, you use the @selector syntax, and you can just pass any old message up the chain. And there is no, I wouldn't say there's no way to really formalize it, because you certainly could. But what you do need is to, in modern Objective-C, I would say that you need to know what that selector is, so the compiler can tell you if you're, basically making up a selector. I mean, we're not dealing with Ruby here, where you can just make up anything and have it crash with this crazy stack trace,
But for the example of like, okay, you've entered in all your information, your username, your password. Now you've clicked like a login button.
Right.
So you touch up inside. Selector goes up. Is that calling a selector on the view controller, which is going up the view chain? How does that work?
Yeah, so let me talk about the actual chain. So like I said, it's like a tree, and the root of the tree is actually your application delegate. So the application delegate is kind of the last stop in the responder chain. And then after that, it's actually that root view controller, or it's actually the window, and then the root view controller on that window. So it kind of bubbles up. So everything that you add as a sub view controller or sub view to that becomes part of the responder chain. For iOS, for Mac, it's a little bit different. It's just basically the views. The view controllers are not part of the chain. So you basically have everything. You know how you have basically, it's almost a reflection of the view hierarchy, and that's a very tree-like structure. So basically what happens is when you tap on that login button, or you tap on the go button, or whatever it is tapping basically a leaf in that tree, and it's kind of bubbling up to the root via that connection chain of the view hierarchy, more or less. So that's kind of what happens when you tap the go button or the login button and you're sending that message. Or actually, that's kind of the way that I do things now, personally in my own apps, is to grab that message and then pass it along the responder chain that way. So what's nice also is it's pretty easy to send a message up the chain. It's basically one line of code, something to do with a UI application, shared application, and look for like send event to from something, or send action to from event. And that'll get you a long ways as far as just sending messages up the responder chain.
So what would the to and the from be in this example of the login?
So, and this is where, knowing all these different patterns that exist in Cocoa and iOS development. The first one that we talked about is the delegate with the callback delegates. That's a pretty common one. The other one is this target action deal. And that basically just says that any target, any object can be passed an action, which is basically a message. And for all intents and purposes, for us, it's just a selector. So any target action deal has a convention as well. You could pass no arguments to it. You can pass one argument to it, and that's usually when you see on the IB action, when you create an IB action in code, you'll see it kind of creates the ID sender for you. That's generally always the first one. So that to is kind of who it's going to, and the action is obviously the selector that we're sending, and the from is generally always going to be that sender. And so now you've got kind of something that you see more commonly when you actually do a button and you, like an interface builder or even in code, when you add a target and an action, you're basically telling what specific object, what action you want to perform, and you're telling it who sent the message.
So this makes it sound somewhat explicit, but it sounded like before you were implying that some of this was implicit, that it would just do the right thing under the right circumstances. Yeah,
so with the responder chain, so when you're doing a specific action or a specific target, if you have, basically, if for the beginners, you'll generally send all targets to the file's owner. If you're using, if you're using a view controller nib, you'll say, well, you'll add a button, and you'll say, you'll drag the line to the file's owner, and you'll have an action that you connect it to. And then that's being very explicit. The way that you'd be implicit and use a responder chain, you've also got in the nib file that first responder deal. And you just drag it in there, and that'll basically, and sometimes it'll be slow when it pops up, but it's inspecting all the actions in the responder chain from that point. And I think it's just for the application. I don't know exactly what the scope is of that popover there, but basically you could just connect an action to the responder chain that way. And what that basically does under the covers is, how we had the send action to from event method, you're still specifying the action and you're specifying from, but for to, you're saying nil, which basically that nil is what's targeting the responder chains, which means that you can also do this for buttons. So if you have a button and you specify the target as nil, that will also go up to the responder chain as well.
So one thing that I'm a little bit fuzzy on still with the responder chain is, so it goes to this first responder, whoever it is that is supposed to take care of that first, and then does it just automatically know who to bubble up to next if it's not going to handle that, or do you have to explicitly tell it from there?
Right, so that's where the whole chain comes in. So if you also notice on the UI responder class, there's a next responder method, and that's what happens. So it'll basically say, it basically does very simply, does this object respond to this selector? If no, well, what's your next responder? Does that one do it? And it just keeps bubbling up the chain that way. And that's what makes it so dynamic and so flexible that you really don't care who handles it. All you care about is that, well, I have this message that's login. Okay, whoever is going to implement login probably has some idea that I want to log into the system. And it's kind of this really general assumption of like, well, that you name these methods correctly. So that's kind of what makes the magic work, is kind of a combination of convention and then this infrastructure that's already there for you.
Okay, walk us up an example responder chain just for benefit of everyone listening. So you start with a view, and it goes.
Well, so you can see here on my slides, my nice view controller responder chain diagram, right? You guys not seeing this?
Looks good to me.
Crickets.
It's very zen.
Yeah, sure.
I like the color scheme.
I know, man. I worked all night on that for you guys.
Why did you use PowerPoint?
So it would animate better.
Oh.
No, wait. That's not the right answer. So I think there's a few diagrams actually, and I think they're in the Apple Docs. I'll have to grab a link for that for you. As far as, I guess, how the responder chain works. And, I mentioned that the application delegate is part of the chain, and it's basically a reflection of your view hierarchy. So basically what happens is, and like I said, when you tap a button, for example, you're basically telling the system that that's the first responder, and then that one kind of starts this whole process off. So,
that button, it has its own responder, then it passes up the chain to a super view.
No, well,
right?
not exactly. So it doesn't use views. So when you add views and view controllers and buttons and all that stuff to the view, all that responder chain stuff is done for you automatically. You'll notice that there is no set next responder method on UI responder, because it's all done for you. If you do try to override set next responder, because I think you can, you will get a lot of problems. And this is from experience, having tried this. So you don't need to do this. Just kind of use it as is, and it will get you a long way. So whatever the system decides will be the next responder, and that's just kind of the way it'll bubble up the chain, and it won't use the view hierarchy exactly. That's just kind of like my visual model of the way that it looks. But it just basically follows that next responder method to kind of basically do a while loop over that chain.
Okay, I was just trying to get a visual image of what the next responder is going to be.
Yeah, and the next responder, so generally it'll be, if it's the view, if that particular view or responder handles it, it'll be that one, and then the next responder will generally be the super view, and then it'll be the view controller, and then it's the window, and then it's the app delegate. So it kind of goes in that. And I would refer to this picture, I think, of the event architecture that probably explains that in a better detail. But one of the other things that you can do with the responder chain is that you can follow it yourself. There's no reason you can't. So you can write your own while loop, and I've done this in debugging, is to kind of make my own category on UI responder that says print out responder chain, and all it does is say while next responder, bubble up, print out the current responder, and then bubble it up, and then keep going. And that's really useful for debugging, because that also helped me figure out as far as when the responder chain doesn't work. And it doesn't work in your view controllers if you try to launch something before view did appear is called. Now think about it. It's really important though. View did appear happens when your view or view controller is in the view hierarchy. So if this kind of models that view hierarchy, like I said, that whole tree structure, if it's not in that tree structure that connects up to the delegate and all the other top level stuff, there's no way. It's basically you've severed the chain before that. So if you send messages up the responder chain before view did appear or after view did disappear, your messages are basically going to end up at nil eventually, because it's not going to bubble up all the way to the top. So that's one caveat that you need to look at. But I would encourage you to try it out in your own apps. It's a really simple method to write. It maybe takes 4 lines of code, depending on where you put your curly braces. So.
Oh, as a warning to our users, UI scroll view had a bug where it didn't pass on the responder chain correctly. I hope it's been fixed, but at least with iOS 5 and possibly iOS 6, it was not working.
Well, that would be a pretty big problem.
Workaround is not pretty, but we got to figure it out.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad I started using it after iOS 5.
So are these calls to the next level in the chain? Are they synchronous calls, or does it split off another thread to handle that stuff?
Yeah, so it's basically in the same thread in my experience, or the same. It'll block. So if you call that send action method, it'll block until it gets done. So yeah, be aware of that as well.
But these are kind of fire and forget, right? Like you're not going to get not fire and forget necessarily, but you're not going to get a response back. Like you can't get
So you could. So there's a couple of hacks that I've kind of discovered in my use of the responder chain. Well, first of all, what you should also do is that if you're not sure that an event or a message or whatever is not being handled in a responder chain, the send action to from event message will return a Boolean whether it was handled or not. So if it kind of made it to the end and nobody handled it, it'll say no. And then you can kind of debug from there. So you can always check that return value and see how things are going. So that's where maybe you might want to check that and then print out the responder chain to see if it's been disconnected somehow, or if you're in the wrong branch or something, that the thing that you expected to handle that particular event is in a different branch of the view hierarchy than you expected. That's also been something that I've run into as well. What was the original question? I was on a train of thought and then I lost it there.
I was asking about whether you can get a response back. That's what I was thinking, but I don't think that doesn't fit the pattern, right? Like if you're firing an event, it's an event. It's not it's not something where you're asking a question and expecting a response.
Right. So, so here's the thing is like you've got that from parameter and, you generally want to fill that in because that is kind of your only way to get back to where you were. And this is kind of my original hack. So when you have like a network responder, you'll generally want to know what's going on with that. And one of the ways that you do that is having a delegate. And so you basically will say, well, I'm sending this a message and let me know what's going on, whether there's an error or there's progress or I need to do authentication or something like that. So you'll have like delegate callbacks for that. Well, setting the delegate is not always not an easy thing to do if it's kind of that detached, right? If you're not using a singleton, which I hope you're not, it's pretty hard to set the delegate. So think about the form of the set delegate message on any object, right? So if you have a delegate property, you get two methods. You'll get a delegate accessor, which tells you what the delegate is, and you have a set delegate : mutator or a setter. And if you look at it, it's basically the exact same form as the action : sender syntax, right? We don't really, in Objective-C, we don't care what the parameters are. We don't do any type checking on parameters. So one of the hacks that I did early on, just kind of messing around, was send the set delegate from self up the responder chain, and that way the network thing, the network object that's somewhere in my responder chain would send all of those event messages back to whatever it was that I passed in as the from object. So I could set it as self, or I could set it as the view controller, something like that. But basically it would set the delegate first, and like I said, these things are synchronous, so that would be guaranteed to be called first. Set the delegate on the view controller, and then after that I could send my general login message, and then after that I basically got my communication channel between my network guy and my view controller that has the information that the delegate or the network login command might need, and do all that hackery that way.
Okay, so the view controller sends something up the responder chain saying, "Hey, let me know that I'm the responder to this type of an event when this happens." So when it passes up the button click for the login, it just kind of waits for that response. Am I getting that right?
So it doesn't really wait for a response. I mean, other than the
waiting is not the right word, but it kind of sits and does its thing until it gets the message from.
Right. So this kind of whole little weird kind of hackety pattern that I came up with is kind of an abuse of the responder chain, in basically using a set property method to set the delegate so you can get all this so basically you can open up this communication channel for yourself when you do something that requires much more callback information for you. Seems
kind of a little bit sketchy though, because if someone else also is interested in finding out when network call's complete, it's going to, these guys, because they're really decoupled, they don't really know even who they're talking about, let alone who else is talking to that thing. So it seems like there's a risk that these guys are going to trample on each other and kind of take it, I register for a delegate from my view controller, and then you register for a delegate from your view controller, and suddenly I'm no longer getting any notifications anymore.
Right. And that's kind of what I found. This is kind of like a hack. That's why I'm explicitly trying to say it's a hack. But it was a fun thing to discover that I could do stuff like that with the responder chain, because, again, that first parameter is basically the from or the sender. And if that first parameter on your method is basically who you want to be the delegate instead, like I said, it doesn't check types. It'll just call set delegate on the sender. And, it's pretty fun. So as far as addressing what you're saying about the responder chain and that little hack, yeah, that is kind of a problem. That's where I I guess inspired Graham Lee to write about a command bus pattern, which I guess he had seen from somewhere. So I guess that this whole idea of a command bus that I recently released has been around for a while. I just kind of took some of the stuff and ideas that Graham had posted on his blog and in that little project that he had, and I've put it on steroids. And I think actually the command bus is really the responder chain on steroids as well. So what the command bus pattern does is lets us fire off commands. So the limitation, like you said, of the responder chain is that we only can send Objective-C selectors or messages that way. But the idea holds is that what we want to do is embrace the message passing environment of Objective-C, right? So message C or Objective-C is message passing. So you can send any message to any object as long as it implements it and it won't crash. And using the responder chain is basically a way to send a message to someone in the chain that might handle that. Now, what the command bus does is kind of encapsulate these messages into a collection of parameters. And also what it does, and what I've been kind of experimenting with, is encapsulate some logic. So if you want any callback logic within the command, so basically the command can handle some rudimentary parsing stuff for you before it passes it back to the sender, which you should also pass. So I guess the general thing is this command bus is really a communications channel for your application. And it really, to me, it's kind of an extension to the responder chain pattern, even though it's kind of sits aside from the responder chain itself.
So on the surface, it appears a bit like kind of a service bus and service bus that would be used kind of like an enterprise, like distributed systems. Is that a fair comparison to what you're talking about here?
Right. So I remember when in my enterprise days, I always looked at these message bus things and things like a queuing system and all that stuff. And I thought it was way overkill until I learned what it was actually for, which is kind of, basically load balancing and evening out the workload so that, work can still get done basically when the hardware or the machine is ready for it, which is kind of the way that this thing works also. So yeah, it is a lot like that. And, I guess we noticed that after the fact.
So walk us through kind of the login thing we were talking about before. How would that get set up with this MGP command bus?
Yeah, so with the command bus, once you have that thing installed, you would have to set up your own little handler. So there's a protocol in there. It's MGP command handler that basically says, well, can you execute a command and execute the command, and it'll also return an error. And if you're going to do the login, you still do the same stuff with the responder chain and all that stuff, and at least with the text fields and all that. But when you go to the actual login, what you would do instead is create a login command, and that you would want to extend from MGP command. I think there's a base class in there, but there's also an interface as well. And now what that will do is basically, instead of in the responder chain example, you'd say send a login message, and all that gets passed as a parameter is a sender. There's no username, there's no password or hash password or whatever else. There's no way to call you back explicitly. So you can put all that information in the command. So you could just say, login command dot username equals this, login command dot password equals that. You could encrypt it before it saves it into the thing and all that stuff. You could have the sender, so you could have where that command originated from. So basically, who sends that on? So whoever's displaying that view can be notified of anything that happens after the fact. You can also say like that this login command is for a specific server. Say it's like the Twitter OAuth login command, and it has to parse some JSON. Well, you could eventually make a base network command that will parse JSON for you automatically and put that into some nice little properties in that command. So what happens is when that command finishes and it sends the the command callback message to the object that you specify, the sender, it'll send you the command back, and then you can just query the command. Well, hey, what was the actual response that's basically been pre-processed for you? So by the time it gets to the view, you don't have to do any parsing work already. It's already been done by the command or the handler, or whoever does what work. But basically all you do is you create this command, you send it along the bus, and then the bus will handle it. That handler gets done. It'll create a little NS operation in the background for you, basically a queue, and processes stuff asynchronously. And, you don't have to worry about it at that point, other than making sure that your handler works correctly as far as the network stuff goes. But, basically it is kind of a set it and forget it, and it's asynchronous automatically. So, I find that's kind of nice, and it really defines the lines as to what the view controller is responsible for. So there's what happens after the command is done, it's successful or not. You can pop up your little login successful kind of message, or failed, and you could, display the error if you need to, that kind of thing. And it separates that view, that presentation logic from all that network, business logic, communication logic, all that craziness that is headless anyway. This command bus really defines that line really explicitly, which is what I think the big downsides to a lot of what the things that the MVC haters say is that there's no the lines get blurred, and I think that this will clean up those lines pretty well.
I think I'm following with the idea that the view controller generates this command saying I want to do a login, and then that command gets put on the bus. But where does the logic for actually doing the logging in, is that embodied in the command itself, or is there some other thing that's like seeing these commands come along the bus and saying, oh, login commands, I know how to handle those, let me go ahead and do that for you?
Right, so I'm still kind of experimenting with it, because it can go in the command or the handler. The idea with the handler is that that's supposed to basically execute the command. And, I've gone back and forth on this in my own projects, and I feel like I'm still discovering how this thing should work well. But I think the general rule of thumb is that I've come up with so far, if it's kind of plumbing stuff, like it's basically like the network logic that is, so general, like creating an NSURL session, setting the callback, setting, all the things that you need to get a network communication thing to work, is where the handler should be used. And if you're doing command-specific parsing logic, that seems to be, or even command-specific setup logic, that seems to be where the command, putting that logic in the command is useful. For example, I've actually had to implement communication channel with Amazon S3 web services, or the API. And what I've done myself is that, or if you're familiar with it, you've got to basically sign in with your keys, your access key and your access secret. So you basically have to use those two pieces of information to sign all of your network requests. So what I've done there is I've got basically a generic network handling handler that will say, well, is this a network command? Yes. Well, I can handle you. Now, network command, give me a request. And because it's a network command, it knows that the command knows how to generate a request. And in the request, I go ahead and fire off all the request signing logic, the things that you have to do to sign the header, and then pass that off to, basically have that generate the request, and the request is generated in the handler. After that, it kind of continues on, and then it gets sent off over the network and gets the call back. And then eventually what will also happen is the command will get some of the more specific callbacks when it does come back, and do simple things like parsing the XML that needs to come back from Amazon, and also cleaning that up into something that's more appropriate for just an Objective-C app. Basically converting it to an NS dictionary that's for easy use down the line in the application. So that's kind of where I've done things so far.
I'm a little skeptical about the implementation inheritance you have going on there, where, like, if you've got the network code in a base class and then you've got your kind of custom stuff in a subclass, then it's going to be really irritating to test that. If you're using composition instead, then you can just swap out the networky stuff with fake networky stuff. But because you're inheriting and you're doing it that way, it's going to be really hard to fake out the network stuff if it's coming in from a superclass.
Well, yeah, there's no reason you couldn't use composition over inheritance, which is another rule of thumb there. But like I said, I'm still experimenting with stuff to see how things work out. But I mean, I think generally,
you would describe.
Yeah, I mean, just generally that the command logic just has some of the stuff that basically will help the handler set things up, and it also takes away the need for the handler to know all the post-processing stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, that you want to just be able to plug in, if you're making your own kind of special type of command, you just want to be able to plug in the stuff that's relevant, and all of the boring kind of plumbing is handled by, a superclass or whatever.
Well, it's also handled by the handler itself. And like I said, that network plumbing is something that you don't want to do all the time. What generally people seem to do in their applications is write a network manager singleton, because manager makes it more official. And, once you get singletons in your code, I mean, it's all downhill from there. It really couples your application to this network thing. And by sending commands, you really don't care if it's an actual network manager or if it's this mock manager that returns, pre-rendered responses and things like that. So it really is a nice way to set up your applications as far as just decoupling things.
I like the decoupling, and I like that it gives you somewhere to put this stuff that everyone, like, one of the things, Saul, me and you have talked about this, I think, but one of the things that really irritates me about these debates or discussions around MVC is people tend to seem to think that because there's an M, a V, and a C, everything has to live in one of those three places. I actually think, I know that's not the case. You can just put this stuff in regular old classes, and we've talked about this a few times on the show before, I think. But at the same time, I kind of like this as at least another place to put the stuff that isn't the view controller and isn't the model, and definitely isn't the view. So that's kind of neat. Yeah,
well, and what's nice about this is that it's it's like I said, it's a communication channel. It's an MVC thing, but it's also got kind of an input-output, so that you can send stuff outside of the MVC architecture or pattern that you've got for a particular set of classes for an app, and you can also get a response back. So it's still also doing things that MVC would do anyway, which is kind of have an observer kind of pattern, and that's kind of what the whole callback functionality of the command bus does. It'll just kind of let you know. It's less observer and more of the Hollywood thing. We'll tell you what's going on, and yeah, it's just nice to, like you said, just have a place for this stuff, which is again where everybody seemed to put all this stuff in singletons, and now you don't have to put it in a singleton, and now you don't have to have this stuff be tightly coupled in your app. You also don't have to have it live forever in your app. There's still things with like lifecycle that I need to work on for the command bus, as far as being able to tear down certain handlers and things. I think right now they kind of live for the lifecycle of the command bus, but I'm looking at ways to kind of just clean it up so that say you don't use the network, or the network is down, it'll just kind of destroy the network handler, and that way, well, you can't send network commands, because there's no network, things like that. So what's also nice is if you look at the command bus signature, you have a method for can handle command. And I made that a class method because it's just really simple validation for the handler that doesn't do anything. It doesn't instantiate all the heavyweight stuff that the handler would need to do to live. Like, say it needs to set up a network. Well, if you can't send anything to the network anyway, or if the network's not connected, why do I bother putting together an NSURL session in the first place? So I kind of did that. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. It could still change. But what's nice about that is that what you can do is it returns a Boolean whether it can handle it or not. So basically it'll say you set up your command, say, can I send this network request? And say you have a button that needs to work or, be enabled or not based on whether the network is active. Well, you just prepare your command like usual and just send it up to the bus and say, hey, can you do this command? And if no, well, just disable the button. And I've used this a couple places in my UI, and it's been awesome. So all I do is, when I'm ready to re-enable that button, is recreate the command, resend it up the chain, and it'll say, yeah, I can handle it now, and it re-enables the button. It's really nice. It's decoupled still.
That's awesome. That's a really nice example of where that decoupling can really pay off. Is the UI or the view controller doesn't care why it can't do that. It just knows I can't do that right now, so let me, give that feedback in the UI without having to understand, is the network available? Is my reachability API doing whatever?
Right, exactly. And it's getting all that specific cruft away from the view controllers, which I think really helps to clean these things up and get away from the massive view controller pattern that so many people also seem to adhere to. And I have noticed that even before my view controllers were, I would say, generally lighter weight, they've basically gone on a diet with this pattern. They basically only manage the pixels on the screen, which has been awesome. Enabling things to show up on the screen or hiding things or moving things around. I can really let my view controllers focus on the presentation of the pixels on the screen, which has been really, really nice to keep that separate.
That's something we can all get behind.
Yeah, definitely.
2 thumbs up.
Yeah, you have the view controller then has a single responsibility, more or less.
Right.
And you have other classes or other job handlers or whatever you want to call them that are out there that do these other jobs, and so you can segment the responsibility according to where it actually belongs instead of, like you said, kind of piling everything up in the view controller and just saying, well, I don't know where else to put it.
Well, yeah, and it also helps by not putting things in a singleton, which is, like I said, a common solution to that problem of, decoupling with, or I guess segregating responsibility, but it still leaves things tightly coupled. And I think this solves that particular problem as well.
Right, because it's just a message sent on a system that's meant to handle those jobs.
Exactly. It's following that same message passing paradigm. It's just the message in this case is a command that's basically an entire class. So it's kind of a message on steroids in the Objective-C sense.
Does MGP in MGPCommandBus stand for Magical Panda?
It does. Okay. I couldn't think of a better 3-letter acronym.
So I got one last question, which is maybe a stupid question. The MGPCommandBus, is that using the Responder chain, or is it an alternative to the Responder chain?
So it is an alternative to the Responder chain. I had toyed around with kind of hooking it up inside the Responder chain, but because selectors are different enough from command objects, I didn't want to confuse the two. Now I'm sure what I could do is have the command bus be the first responder, wrap that selector and all that stuff into a command, and have that fire up the command bus and things like that. I could do that, I'm sure, but I hadn't gone that far just yet. I kept them separate. One of the things that's also kind of good to know is that as far as specifically for the MGPCommandBus, I made a couple of additions. So I had mentioned, as far as the responder chain, there is that send action to from event method. That's a method on UI application. So what I've done in the command bus is make a category on UI application that's basically send command, and there's some variations on it, send command from self, things like that. So that what you can do is, or basically it's the same paradigm. You're just following the paradigm that Apple has already stated with its API and just doing something along those same lines. So I tried to make it very similar. And it's also got some handy setup helpers. So basically in your app delegate, you could just set an array of classes for the delegate method, and it'll kind of set itself up automatically on demand. So it doesn't set up a command bus right away until you actually send messages or commands up the bus. So yeah, it's a pretty nice project, I think. It's a very low level plumbing project. But I'm hoping in the future for it though, to have some contributions for, maybe like a network handler by default, which I may contribute, to have other various handlers and eventually maybe get a set of commands like like a Twitter command, or things like that just kind of let me do all these things with the command bus. And the thing is, I know they're all asynchronous. I know they're all going to be handled in the queue and all that stuff. So there's still some things that can be done. One of the other things that's really nice that should be pretty easy for the bus to do is to serialize the commands. So one of the other methods, I guess one of the interfaces that a command implements is the NS coding or the NS coder. I forget which one. One of them where it tells you that you need to use this to write stuff to. And what it does is it basically lets you serialize a command. So basically you can save the state of a command to disk, basically. And what this lets me do is eventually, and I haven't added this, is eventually what I could do is basically let the command bus listen to the application will terminate notification and basically say, well, all the commands that haven't been done, well, let's serialize those. And we'll save those to disk. And then the next time that the bus launches, we can just say, well, application did finish launching and check out that notification as well. And then, reinflate those commands and then just, resubmit them to the bus. And then, everyone's goes on their merry way. And that's another thing that I think those enterprise things do is they serialize those commands or those messages so that they can be replayed later.
Yes, they do. Durable storage and all that fun message bus stuff.
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely a possibility with this project. And forgot what I was going to say about it, but it's still something that could be really nice. So what you could also do is basically save a collection of commands eventually and replay it. So if you wanted to undo, or maybe you undo some action and then you just kind of have like a macro that's basically a collection of commands in serial. You just send them to the bus, save off those commands in some kind of plist or something, reinflate them and send them off again and again and again. And, it really doesn't care. So there's a lot of neat things that you could eventually do with the bus. And, hopefully I'll get to some of them because, I'm doing what I need right now and, I don't need it to serialize just yet.
And, presumably this is open source and on GitHub, so you could even get some people to contribute so you didn't have to do all the work yourself.
Whoa, really? Is that how that works?
I've heard it. That's how that works.
Is that what the kids are doing these days?
Forking all over the place.
Get your fork off my lawn. So yeah, it's open source. It's out there. I think my GitHub repo is github.com/magicalpanda, and you can find it under MGPCommandBus there. And download the bits. Let me know what's going on. One of the other features of the bus that was also something that I needed was the idea of subcommands. So a lot of times I try to decompose bigger things into smaller problems, and that meant that for certain things, like just sending one giant command was just too much work. Well, conceptually, it was a lot of work, I guess. So I broke it down into smaller pieces. And basically what I have is the view controller will just say, well, send this huge command. And what the command will do is send smaller commands that break it up into pieces. And they set those subcommands, or, basically the parent command is only done when all the subcommands complete. So basically the view controller gets a true callback when everything is actually done. So hopefully that's all that is helpful for people.
Yeah, hopefully it does help some folks. And I think the approach is a fairly common one, not just in mobile development, but in general, having this kind of command bus or some kind of side process or, way of threading out and handling things asynchronously. And, there are definite benefits to it, and I think you've outlined them pretty well. Let's go ahead and get to the picks. James, do you want to start us off with picks?
Well, sure. I'm going to have one pick. I'm going to pick MongoDB University. A friend of mine had signed up for these classes, and he was talking about it, and I had done a little bit of MongoDB enough where I wasn't going to take one of the beginning classes, but I signed up for MongoDB for DBAs. So most of my work has been as kind of a developer doing stuff like that. But I hadn't really done like replica sets, setting up a cluster, sharding. The video is actually very good. So I learned a lot. So I've been going over the past 7 or 8 weeks and watching a lot of MongoDB videos, and they've got some homework. And at the end, you get a certificate, which is fantastic, right? Everyone loves certificates. It'll actually be my first certificate ever on anything, but overall, I've learned a lot. So I can recommend if you want to get into MongoDB, especially if you're coming from like a relational background I think the one-on-one classes I would imagine are pretty good. So yeah, a lot of good videos. So check it out.
Very nice. Pete, what are your picks?
I just have an image of framed MongoDB university certificates now. Can't get out of my head.
It's going to be my Twitter background.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it would come with like a nice kind of one of those gold kind of like stars and like maybe a ribbon.
Oh, there you go.
Well, I'll buy one if it doesn't come with that.
Yeah. Mail order. So my first pick is a conference, MDevCon, which is in Amsterdam. It's happening in March. I'm guessing Saul may be speaking there.
Maybe.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yes, actually. Yeah, I'm giving a keynote there on what's next in mobile development. So that should be fun.
Oh, I nicely set you up for a plug there. So yeah, MDevCon, I went there, I went to that last year, I think it was last year, and it's a great conference, in a great city in Amsterdam. Yeah, it's a really good conference, so, I recommend going. My second pick, I've already picked this before, I'm gonna pick it again, because I can do that. Pragmatic Thinking and Learning is, the book I referenced a little bit earlier on, or at the start of the show actually, that talks about the Dreyfus model and kind of how our brains learn, and lots and lots of really, really, really good stuff in that book. I keep on recommending this book to people. It's probably going to be, if you haven't read it, it'll be the most useful book you read this year. How's that for a sell? And then my last pick, I'm kind of obliged to do this as an employee of ThoughtWorks. It's a link to a presentation called "Does My Bus Look Big in This?" It's actually an old presentation from like 2008. It talks about how enterprise service buses, those big kind of gnarly things that we kind of touched on earlier, are actually really pretty horrible to deal with. I don't think anyone listening to the show is planning on implementing a big ESB, a big TIBCO ESB, just because we were talking about message buses, but I'm obliged to tell you not to do that. Please don't use TIBCO or anything like that for your message busing needs. Not really related to this show, but there you go. That's it.
All right. I'll go ahead and jump in with some picks. So the first pick I have is I found a free memory app on the App Store for my Mac, and it's kind of nice. Typically, I'm not really using up all of my memory, but sometimes I am, and it's usually Chrome's fault, incidentally. But it is something that kind of, it shows me how much memory I have free, and then it has some algorithms to free up the memory. So really like that. And one other pick that I have, I used to register all of my domains on GoDaddy, and between their tacky commercials and the fact that their user interface is impossible, I switched over to Hover, which is really, really nice. And I've been slowly moving my domains over, and I finally just got fed up and just wanted to really get everything moved over, but I didn't have time to go in and make sure that all of the DNS was correct and everything before I moved it over. And so I called Hover up, and it turns out that they have a valet service. So I went in and changed my password on GoDaddy so that they can have the password. It's not anything close to anything I've used anywhere else. And they are moving all of my domains over. So I'm really excited to be able to just be done with GoDaddy, and just another thing that I just love about Hover. So I'm going to pick hover.com, and we'll let Saul give us some picks.
So my first pick is a Mac app, and it's an iOS app too. It's gotten an update recently. It's pretty nice. If you do mind mapping at all, it's pretty cool. I use this to take notes and organize my talks for conferences and things. It's called MindNode, and they've got a MindNode Pro version on the Mac App Store. It's really nice. The iCloud syncing actually works, and it's got a Mac and an iOS app. So check it out. It's pretty cool. And my other pick is the Big Nerd Ranch. Now, recently I went to visit Pete up over there in San Francisco, which it's amazingly unseasonably warm right now, which is a pleasant surprise. But I was in San Francisco doing some teaching for the Big Nerd Ranch, which I'll be doing from here on in. So I'll be kind of learning the ropes for a little while, but I'll be doing that as a new gig, along with all the application development things that I do. So check out the Big Nerd Ranch. They do a lot of cool classes, and yeah, it should be fun.
You heard it here first, folks. Is
Man,
that an exclusive? Is that an exclusive announcement?
I scooped my own podcast. Man, kind of idiot host am I?
You can rush to get out the door.
This doesn't go up for a week, so you
got to accelerate that, Chuck. We got to get this exclusive.
Oh, there we go.
I'll do the transcript. I'll do everything. Go.
Yeah.
I'm tweeting it right now. Just
There you go. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks for coming, Saul.
Sure, no problem. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
No, I think it was really good, and hopefully I can make it out to Denver and we can go grab lunch again sometime.
Oh, yeah, especially after the Broncos win.
Yeah. Here's
you
hoping.
guys have to face the number one cornerback in the game, though.
Oh, man. I saw the meme on that, and, now it's a nation of Broncos fans against that guy, so I'm good. You guys can all be on the bandwagon for this one game. I'll permit that.
All right. We'll wrap up the show then. We'll catch y'all next week.